and welcome. My name is Don Brash. I was appointed Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand in 1988, a role I played for the next 14 years. It was a time of major reform in the New Zealand economy, and the central bank played a major part in that process. Many of the policy and operational changes we introduced over those 14 years period were pioneering. We floated the currency, we introduced inflation targeting, we introduced polymer banknotes, we tightened the efficiency of the central bank, and we delegated the cash cycles operated by the banks. These days, most of those changes are taken for granted, but at the time, they were pioneering. But those achievements in policy and operations were based not just on technical excellence, but on institutional excellence. We had to build a more independent and more accountable central bank. As governor, I signed a public contract with the finance minister that set policy targets and limited operational expenses. To deliver on that contract, my colleagues and I applied governance principles and management disciplines to deliver excellence as an institution. We improved accountability, transparency, efficiency, and effectiveness. I was fortunate to play a leading role in that time of remarkable change, and part of my very good fortune was to have excellent colleagues who could help me in that process. We had no guidebook to guide us. We were pioneering. One of my key colleagues, John Mendzela, came from outside the central bank. He played a major part in building the culture and changing the systems, which meant that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand became an excellent institution. John is with me today to talk about the process and system which he's developed over the last 20 years working with central banks all over the world. I'm sure his approach can add great value to any central banking institution. I hope you can make use of it. John, how did you come to work with central banks on institutional governance and management?
Well, first it was inspiring to come from outside a central bank and work with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand during a period of major change. The lessons I learned there were most useful in helping other organizations achieve successful strategic change. Since that time, I've worked independently with many other central banks who were aiming to modernize or develop or enhance their institutions. My focus has always been on the practicalities of institutional governance and management, not the theory.
How would you describe the institutional situation facing central banks and financial regulators at the moment?
Today and in the future, central banks and financial regulators face a more testing and a more technological environment. The institutional challenges include threats to independence, accountability demands, efficiency pressures. So as institutions, they must manage knowledge and lead knowledge workers in that challenging environment. In fact, Don, central banks and financial regulators need to become not just technically excellent, but also institutionally excellent.
And what do you typically find when you start working with a central bank?
Typically, I find that some particular initiative has already been decided upon as a path forward. For example, restructuring or performance measurement or service costing. The expectations for institutional benefits are high, but they're likely to be disappointed.
Why is disappointment likely?
For three main reasons in various combinations. Firstly, governance, sponsorship, and involvement may be weak, may even be absent. Initiatives are being driven from below by change enthusiasts who lack the credibility and the positional authority to make real change happen. Secondly, the initiative might be only a partial solution based on an inadequate diagnosis of change needs. On its own, it can't achieve much. For example, restructuring will not achieve very much if the underlying issues are organizational culture and management skills. And thirdly, the initiative itself may be too technical or too complicated. Perhaps it's a generic methodology that's being adopted, or perhaps there's reliance on consultants who aren't familiar with central banking institutions, central banking work, and central banking culture.
And what do you do differently?
I try to counter each of those problems. Firstly, to ensure governance level sponsorship is present. Yes, change initiatives should harness bottom-up energy, but they need governance support and oversight to really succeed. Secondly, take a whole of institution view. Ensure that the change initiative is part of an integrated program that tackles all of the issues and not just some of them. And thirdly, achieve customization and practicality. Central banks and financial regulators are a diverse group of institutions. One-size-fits-all approaches simply don't work. So initiatives need to be customized and tailored to the particular circumstances that each institution faces, and they need to be made practical.
And how have you systematized that work?
Firstly, by learning from experiences over time of what has gone well and gone badly, particularly at central banks. I've worked with two colleagues to systematize that learning into a framework and process for institutional excellence, called for short INEX. INEX is a comprehensive approach to help central banks and financial regulators define, measure, achieve, and verify effectiveness and efficiency. It particularly responds to the three issues that we talked about earlier. Firstly, the INEX framework and process is a governance-oriented tool. It can be simply applied across the entire institution and be overseen from governance level. Secondly, INEX defines and measures excellence from an institutional and not a technical perspective. For example, human resources management should develop capability and measure individual contributions. INEX assesses human resource management from that perspective and not as a technical discipline in itself. Thirdly, INEX focuses on the unique circumstances of central banks and financial regulators. For example, business organizations don't need to think much about their mandate, but central banks and regulators do. By contrast, central banks and financial regulators don't need to worry about profitability as long as the funding they need to support their operations is secure. The title institutional excellence is significant too. A central bank is not just another organization, but a true institution, part of the enduring foundation of an economy. Historically, central banks and financial regulators focused on technical excellence. Their institutional governance and management was secondary. But today, those institutional factors are either the key enabler or the key constraint in effectiveness. So INEX responds to that challenge.
How does INEX differ from the complicated or generic methodologies you criticized earlier?
Fundamentally, it's not a methodology at all. A methodology requires an institution to fit in to the methodological framework. That doesn't work well if the fit isn't a good one or if the methodology is applied poorly. INEX is a framework and a process that can be applied simply and systematically. It can also be applied flexibly. For example, a central bank that has well-established governance and management systems might use it simply as a quality assurance tool, while a central bank or a financial regulator that's newly established or that's facing major change might use the framework to drive their strategic thinking and planning.
But how does INEX actually work?
The INEX framework has 12 dimensions that are the fundamental needs all central banks and financial regulators have in common. The framework moves from the most fundamental aspects of the institution to its routine and finally its exceptional operations. The dimensions are mandate, funding, governance, culture, reputation, capability, organization, management, communication, review, change management, and finally crisis management. The INEX process defines target outcomes for each dimension. Those need to be customized to suit the circumstances of the individual institution. For example, the target outcome for reputation that an emerging central bank might have in a developing economy may be quite different from the target outcome a well-established central bank in a mature economy would seek. Next, through discussions and research, INEX assesses the actual outcome against the target outcome for each dimension. That's an analytical assessment. Finally, and most importantly, INEX checks how well those assessments can be verified. Excellence is a matter of fact, not just self-opinion. Institutional excellence has only been achieved when target outcomes are being attained and that can be reasonably verified. The INEX process sounds simple, and it is, but simple doesn't necessarily mean easy. For some dimensions, such as the institution's mandate, internal analysis might suffice to produce a good result. An external independent view will complement that internal perspective usefully. But for other less technical dimensions, governance, management, organization, culture, an insider's view will not be enough. Future-oriented, external expertise in institutional governance, management, and culture will be essential to make a proper assessment.
What are you hoping to achieve with INEX?
Central banks are vital institutions. I've been privileged to develop unique expertise in central bank governance and management. I hope INEX will help central banks support their independence and deliver on their mandate. So I want two specific things. Firstly, I want to give central banks and financial regulators a fresh thinking point about their institutional governance and management. That thinking point is derived from the specialized world of central banks and financial regulation, but it takes a firm institutional perspective and not a technical perspective. Secondly, I want to help individual central banks and financial regulators apply the framework. They can then internally plan and monitor their institutions and their operations with greater confidence. And externally, as institutions that are self-critical and actively pursue excellence, they can better defend their independence.
And what can central banks and financial regulators who are interested in institutional excellence do next?
Well, firstly, there's background reading on my website, www.mendhurst.com, and indeed on yours, donbrash.com. Secondly, I can, on request, supply a PowerPoint presentation that explains INEX in a more thorough manner. Customized on-site consultancy and training services can be commissioned, but there are also many other ways that INEX can be used, particularly using modern technology. For example, video conferencing, online seminars. Let's be creative. For now, I want to thank viewers for investing time and attention in watching this video. Thanks very much.